introduce Adam Gamoran. Adam is one of the great sociologists of education. He studies broad sets of issues of educational inequality, opportunity, and improvement. His work has focused on interrelating factors related to inequality, including race, gender, tracking, and stratification, and curriculum. His work has focused on educational inequality and improvement in English language arts, in mathematics, and in science. Adam's work exemplifies methodological plurality. His research and his collaborations include rigorous experimental and quasi-experimental approaches that include highly sophisticated quantitative models, but he's also tried to understand underlying phenomena through detailed analyses of practice inside classrooms, schools, and institutions. He's also engaged in cross-cultural analyses. Adam received his PhD in the sociology of education from the University of Chicago and spent most of his career at the University of Wisconsin in the Department of Sociology and the School of Education in a variety of academic roles. For the last 10 years or so, there he directed the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. In 2013, Adam was named president of the W.T. Grant Foundation, one of the most important funders of educational research, perhaps not in terms of dollars, but in terms of the intellectual leadership and guides to the field. The foundation could not be in better hands than those of Adam Gamoran, so please join me in welcoming Adam to the GSC.
Thank you so much for that. Perhaps undeserved welcome, but I do appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to be here at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. This is my fourth visit to Rutgers, and aside from a long ago visit to Bill Firestone in the School of Education, my most recent visits here were to watch the University of Wisconsin play against Rutgers, first in football and then in basketball. So welcome to the Big Ten, and I'm very excited. No one was more excited than I when Rutgers joined the Big Ten. But more to the point of today's visit, I'm excited that several of the grantees of our foundation are here at Rutgers. Rutgers has been pretty successful lately, so you probably don't need me to come and tell you how to win grants from the William T. Grant Foundation. You've already got that expertise locally, but I'll do my part. I'll do my part as well. There are three parts to my talk today. The first part is an introduction to the foundation. The second is a substantive discussion of one of the issues that we're concerned with and in an area where I've done some research. And the third part is more about the logistics and the specifics of competing for funding from the William T. Grant Foundation. Before I get started, I'd like to know who here is on Twitter. Okay, so for those of you on Twitter, take out your phones, follow the William T. Grant Foundation at WT Grant FDN. Follow the William T. Grant Foundation because we are tweeting right now some resources that will be useful. You know, it used to be that you would bring handouts. You don't need to bring handouts anymore. They're on the web, or for your even greater convenience, they're being sent to you through Twitter as I speak. The William T. Grant Foundation was started in 1936 by, amazingly, William T. Grant. Now, Mr. Grant was frustrated. He was a store magnate. And in its heyday, there were over 1,000 Grant stores. They were what we used to call five and dimes because you could buy everything for a nickel or a dime, similar to Woolworth's or Ben Franklin or Kresge's, if you're familiar with any of those. But he was frustrated because he would hire the best and brightest young men to be managers of his stores. And some would work out, and some would not work out. And he wanted to know, why is that? And how can I do a better job of predicting which will be the most effective managers of my stores? And he thought research on human behavior was the best way to answer that question. So he endowed a foundation to pursue questions on human behavior. Well, he never got an answer to his question. But over the 80 years since the foundation was started, the foundation has supported a great deal of important research. Many insights. And we've got a little history section on our website if you'd like to read more about what we've done historically. The specific focus of the foundation's support for research has changed over time. It tends to change along with the most pressing issues of the time. And at present, we have two priorities. Both fall within the general frame of research on young people between the ages of 5 and 25. So within those two domains, one focus is on the use of research evidence in decisions that affect young people. And this was sparked following a realization that although the quality of evidence has improved over time, that doesn't mean the evidence is used. In fact, our grantees have found that the quality of evidence is not a strong predictor of whether the evidence is used in policy and practice. And indeed, we have many examples of bad evidence being used and good evidence being ignored. It turns out, we've learned from our grantees, that the relationships between producers and consumers of evidence and the intermediaries who knit them together is more important than the quality of evidence. And the structures that support those relationships and the incentives that bring people to establish relationships, those are key elements in the use of research evidence. So we support studies of how to create the conditions for evidence use and how the use of evidence affects youth outcomes. We've actually got a couple of grantees here at Rutgers, Tom Mackey in public health and Itzhak Yanovitsky in communication, who are doing some of this important work in specific domains, and we'd love to see more of that. In December, we launched a new phase of our focus on the use of research evidence, which is reflected in the last bullet point on this slide. Now that we've learned something about the conditions that support research evidence, we'd like to know how can we create those conditions. And we'd also like researchers to test our assumption. Got several chairs up here at the front. We'd like some researchers to test hypotheses about how to create those conditions, and also to test our assumption that when decision makers rely on evidence from research to make decisions that affect young people, it turns out better for the young people. We funders and probably we researchers always assume that if only the decision makers would adopt our findings, it would work out for those to whom the findings pertain. But that's an assumption we'd like to see some testing of that. So that's one of our two focuses. The other is on reducing inequality. Now, you don't need me to say that inequality by economic, racial, ethnic, linguistic, and immigrant origins is pervasive in the United States right now. And we have a lot of evidence on the nature and sources of inequality. It's not to say we know everything about this, but we do know quite a bit about it. What's less understood are ways to reduce inequality. And that's our niche within this domain of reducing inequality. We support research on programs, policies, and practices that reduce inequality in youth outcomes. The outcomes we focus on are academic, social, behavioral, and economic outcomes. And often when I talk to researchers, I pose the question, so you can think about this to yourself. In the domain in the domain you study, where you're an expert, do we know enough about the nature and mechanisms of inequality to begin to devise responses to inequality, ways to reduce inequality? If the answer to that question is yes, then we at the Foundation are urging you to move to that research. We know a lot about how bad inequality is and what bad consequences it has. What we need to know more of is how to reduce inequality. Now, inequality has many meanings. Among them are the overall dispersion of an outcome, for example, income or test scores, but also group differences in an outcome. Our focus on the Foundation is in reducing the first and eliminating the second. It's not feasible and probably not even desirable to eliminate inequality entirely when we're talking about inequality as variation. But we know that we could have less inequality than we have today because we've had less inequality in our own past, and many other countries have less inequality than we do, and they are highly productive and successful, and we have been in the past. So some degree of inequality may be necessary to motivate performance, but certainly not as much as we have today. With regard to group differences, there's no justification, and so we'd like to see that eliminated. That's the goal that we hope research that we support will be working towards. Now, one can reduce inequality, one can imagine ways to reduce inequality by holding people at the top down or by pulling people who are lower down up. We're interested in the latter, not the former. Now, inequality is all over the news these days. Why inequality matters. Income inequality threatens the world order. Americans grapple with income inequality. The Washington Post says there are many stubborn kinds of inequality that children face growing up. The Standard & Poor's says inequality is damaging the U.S. economy. And not long ago, President Obama turned his attention to inequality, declaring it the defining challenge of our time. Janet Yellen, the chair of the Federal Reserve, says that the Fed has long had an interest in inequality. Moreover, she commented that research may be able to provide evidence on which public policies are most helpful in building an economy in which people are poised to get ahead, and at the same time to understand whether there are policies currently in place that hold people back or discourage mobility. At the Foundation, we have a four-part argument for why we want to support research on reducing inequality. First, levels of inequality are exceptionally high. And we can see this whether we compare the United States to other countries around the world, or whether we compare ourselves now in 2016 to our own recent past. Inequality is excessive on either measure. Moreover, high levels of inequality are economically and socially harmful. Inequality is a drag on economic productivity, and it breaks down social cohesion. So inequality is excessive, it's harmful, but social policies can combat inequality. We are not paralyzed, we are not helpless in the face of growing inequality. There are concrete steps we can take that will help reduce inequality. Now, if you accept my first, second, and third points, then surely in a room of researchers you'll agree with my fourth point, which is that we need research to identify effective policies, programs, and practices that will reduce inequality. Now, not long ago, I thought I had a pretty good fix on reducing inequality in education. I thought I had strong projections back in 2001 for the future of educational inequality in the course of the 21st century. But in offering these projections, I forgot the words of that profound American philosopher, Yogi Berra, who said, "Prediction is difficult, especially about the future." Now that seems like a funny statement, but in social science, it actually has a ring of truth. Because in the social sciences, we're doing prediction all the time, but we're not really predicting the future. We're actually predicting the past based on evidence from even farther in the past. In other words, we develop a prediction model based on data from events and processes that have already occurred. How much more difficult, and we usually get that wrong, or we can at best offer predictions that are only slightly right. How much more difficult is it when we're actually trying to predict out into the real future? So I have succumbed to this challenge because, well, you'll see. My forecast for the 21st century was when I predicted that racial inequality would decline over the course of the 21st century. Now, I didn't just make this up out of thin air. I had reasons for this prediction. I had observed advances during the 20th century in which inequality was reduced. And it seemed to me, and others, I was not the only one, that a virtuous cycle would emerge in which good things happen, and then more good things happen, building on the good things that have happened in the past. Particularly a convergence in high school completion and a narrowing test score gap, which occurred from the 1960s through the earlier mid-1980s. And I anticipated that this would lead to positive outcomes, then further positive outcomes in the 21st century. And I was not the only one. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, in one of the affirmative action cases, noted that, well, we still need affirmative action today because there's still inequality, but in 25 years, this will no longer be relevant. So she was even more optimistic than I was. I thought it might take 80 years, but nonetheless, both of us saw the 21st century as a period of declining racial inequality in education. And I also said, by 2010, we would know if my forecasts were accurate. Because by 2010, those children of parents who achieved advantages in the 1980s would now be in school themselves. And we'd be able to see whether the gains of the 1980s played out in further gains in the early 21st century. So how are things looking so far? Unfortunately, not so well. This was not my only prediction. I also predicted no change in socioeconomic inequality in education during the 21st century. And once again, I didn't make this up out of whole cloth. I relied on evidence from the 20th century, which had been a period of persistent inequality, as some famous authors labeled it. That is, despite the expansion of education, relative advantages of those from more privileged circumstances were sustained over those who were more disadvantaged, and I anticipated that this would continue in the future. You can see what a genius I am. I just said, what happened in the 20th century? Oh, that's my prediction for the 21st century. There are reasons why it seemed to make sense to predict declining inequality on the basis of race, but stability in the case of socioeconomic status. First of all, unlike race, poor people are not a protected class in the United States. There's no constitutional protections on the basis of poverty. In addition, in contrast to the civil rights movement, there's minimal motivation, maybe lack is too strong, but very little mobilization for the rights of the poor in this country, in contrast to some other countries, and in contrast to other classes of individuals in the United States. So that was a reason for my prediction. How has this prediction turned out? Unfortunately, also not so well, as I will explain. So the questions for today, then, for this part of my talk are, what are the trends in educational inequality, particularly since 2000? What lies behind the numbers? What can we do about it? More broadly, how can research yield evidence on ways to reduce educational inequality among young people in the United States? So the first slide looks at gaps in college enrollment immediately after high school. The line at the top is for the contrast between those in the bottom and top quartiles of the income distribution. The line at the bottom is for the black-white gap. Now, asking about who goes to college immediately after high school is an important indicator. It's important because your likelihood of ever going to college and your likelihood of graduating from college is much greater if you proceed directly from high school to college. So this is the one slide where I look smart, where the results are consistent with my predictions. You can see that since 2000, the gap between whites and African Americans has diminished. It was as high as 20 percentage points back in 1985, and we've commenced a period of decline, a little blip in the mid-2000s, but by 2010, less than 5 percentage point difference between whites and African Americans. Now, of course, both percentages were going up. Percentages for both groups were going up, but the percentage for African Americans going to college immediately after high school was even greater. The increase was even greater than it was for whites. By contrast, the percent change for low versus high income families has been stable, no change since 2000, and essentially no change, some up and down, but overall no change going back all the way to the 1970s. So this is the pattern that I anticipated for all the indicators, but in fact, this is the only indicator where that pattern obtains. Now, these show the difference between whites and African Americans in the likelihood of completing high school and completing college. And here the picture is somewhat different. With respect to high school completion, the gap has continued to diminish all throughout this period. A very rapid decline in the 1970s, followed by a slow but continuous decline since that time. By contrast, the gap in college completion has not diminished, and in fact, since 2000, it's actually gone in the opposite direction, is what I predicted. It's gone up. Now, it's interesting to think about this period here, where the gap in high school completion was diminishing, and the gap in college completion was stable. One could regard this as a great success, because during this time period, the population eligible for college completion was becoming more and more diverse, and yet the graduation rates were stable. So that's kind of a victory, but that's no longer the case. Now, although the percent completing college the percent completing high school has continued to converge, the percent graduating from college has diverged. So the percentage difference between whites and African Americans. Oh, I should have said this is among high school graduates. The percent is now 20 percentage points, which is the greatest that it's been since the 1970s, contrary to my prediction. Here's a prediction for a social class. This is based on the top and bottom quartiles on the NCES composite indicator of socioeconomic class. So it doesn't exactly mean the same in each survey weight, but you can see from the early 90s through 2012, roughly stable over time, somewhat down since 2000, but it was up prior to that, so stable overall. With regard to test scores, here's the NAEP math test for age 13, and you can see that since 2000, the trend for the black-white gap has diminished, but at a very slow pace. Much slower than I, and certainly slower than Justice O'Connor predicted. And the trend by socioeconomics, by whether parents had completed high school versus parents who had completed college, that gap has increased in most recent years. By the way, the 2015 NAEP results were released yesterday, so that doesn't appear in this picture. I haven't looked yet to see whether my picture would have to change. So to summarize the trends that I just reviewed, and if we looked at this for a reading, it would be it's a little more volatile, but similar trends overall. So to summarize the trends, black-white gaps in high school completion and college enrollment have narrowed, but the gap in college completion has widened. There were modest declines in the racial achievement gap, slower than I or Justice O'Connor predicted. According to the latest estimates of NAEP trends, it would take 150 to 250 years to erase the test score gap. So 10 times as long as Justice O'Connor predicted, and 3 to 5 times as long as I predict, 2 to 3 times as long as I predicted. Socioeconomic gaps have remained steady in some areas, such as attainment, but gotten worse in others, such as test scores. So what the heck happened? Why was I so wrong in my predictions? Well, I did a study on this. In 2012, I published a study with two former students, Daniel Long and Sean Kelly, called Wither the Virtuous Cycle, Past and Future Trends in Black-White Inequality in Educational Attainment. We had the idea, as I mentioned earlier, that a virtuous cycle was supposed to narrow the gaps, that improvements in parents' family background, particularly convergence educational attainment, would lead to better schooling experiences, which would then boost the child's educational attainment. Why has this not worked out? Well, there are a number of reasons. The first, which was raised immediately by critics of my 2001 article, was that educational attainment pays off less for blacks than for whites. So as African Americans increase their educational accomplishments, the payoff for their children was not as great as the payoff for whites. And so Carl Alexander and colleagues raised this immediately, and our subsequent research has suggested that they were actually correct. In fact, our research shows that the returns for parent education are 16% lower for blacks as compared with whites. And there's been a greater differential in recent decades compared to earlier decades, and this holds for all level of parental education: high school completion, college enrollment, college completion. No matter which stage parents move towards, the benefits for their children are not as great for African Americans as they are for whites. So the virtuous cycle is being dragged down. Why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, I spotted a convergence in high school completion, but it turns out on-time high school completion is not converged as fast as overall completion rates. And on-time completion is very important for long-term educational attainment. Moreover, the convergence in high school completion includes high rates of equivalency diplomas, the GED, among African Americans, and the GED doesn't pay off as well as the high school diploma. Moreover, wealth inequality between blacks and whites constrains advancement even when educational attainment, and for that matter, occupation and income, become more equal over time. So educational attainment alone is not all that it takes to have payoff for young people. You need some resources to activate that educational attainment. In addition, there are persisting school quality differences. There's teacher sorting between and within schools. There's persisting residential segregation, so that parents with higher levels of education are unable to confer the advantages of that education onto their children. Now, if the weaker payoff to educational advancement for African Americans has dragged the virtuous cycle, mass incarceration shattered it, essentially turning a virtuous cycle into a vicious one. There's been a dramatic increase in U.S. incarceration rates, as everyone knows, and African Americans are greatly overrepresented. African American males are greatly overrepresented within that increased rates of incarceration. Of course, this reduces educational attainment for those incarcerated young men. Anyway, not only that, it's harmful to children. It has both cognitive and non-cognitive effects on the next generation. And these harmful effects are especially salient for African American boys, as my colleague and former student Anna Haskins has shown. So mass incarceration also contributes to the rise of single-parent families and the increasing race gap in family composition. So for all of these reasons, then, mass incarceration has turned has spun the virtuous cycle into a vicious cycle. So these are the reasons, not taking these conditions sufficiently into account are the reasons that my predictions we can now see were so far off base. That's with respect to racial inequality. Why have the SES gap widened instead of stayed stable, as I predicted? Well, one has to do with rising income inequality. Now, there are many ways to depict rising income inequality. This is my favorite. It comes from the work of Thomas Piketty. It's in Capital in the 21st Century, but it's also appeared in several earlier reports that he did. This period here was one of rising inequality, similar to today. But then we underwent the Depression and the World War II and the post-war years, and this led to what some have called the Great Compression, a dramatic drop in income inequality. Oh, I should have explained. What we're looking at here is the percent of income obtained by the top 10% of the population. So if there were no income inequality, what portion of income would the top 10% get? 10%. But instead, back here in prior to the Great Depression, the top 10% of the population was getting about 50% of the income. And during the post-war years and through the 1970s, that dropped all the way down to below 35%. So that's a pretty dramatic difference, a compression of income. But since 1980, that has spiked upward. It's grown steadily upward, so that we're now back to pre-depression rates of income inequality. One reason that I particularly like this chart is that it shows the difference between earned income and unearned income. That is, income that includes capital gains and income that excludes capital gains. For most of our history, those two lines run together. But since the 1980s, those two lines have diverged. So income inequality, when you include capital gains, is even greater than income inequality just based on earned income. That's a phenomenon that's distinctive to this wide gap between the diamonds and the triangles is distinctive to our own historical era. So rising income inequality then means that the difference between the top quartile and the bottom quartile of the income distribution are very different. The level of resources they have at their disposal are more different because inequality is growing. And that is likely to explain some of the rising inequality in outcomes for children. Another element of this is increasing gaps in family investments in children. This comes from the work of Robert Putnam in his book, Our Kids, although the graph actually comes from the magazine, The Economist, which created a graph to show some of Putnam's findings. So what we're looking at here is the difference between parents with a bachelor's degree or more, and parents with no more than a high school diploma. And we're looking at changes over time in the number of minutes per day that parents spend in developmental care with their children between ages 0 and 4. Developmental care means care where there's some processes going on. Might be talking with the child, reading with the child, not simply changing the diaper or providing food. So everybody's increased the amount of developmental care they provide, but families with more educated parents have increased that more rapidly, so there's a greater differential now than there has been in the past. A third reason for increasing effects of income inequality on outcomes, for increasing socioeconomic gaps in educational outcomes, is increasing income segregation. Now this graph comes from the work of Patrick Sharkey, one of our William T. Grant scholars, who in his book Stuck in Place writes about the increasing concentration of poverty in urban neighborhoods. He's got a number of graphs like this. This one is for Philadelphia, and the darker the square, the greater the concentration of poverty. And you can see the difference between Philadelphia in 1970 and Philadelphia in 2009, how much sharper the concentration of poverty was after 40 years. So for all these reasons, inequality, socioeconomic inequality has not remained the same, but on some markers it's gotten even worse. So what are we going to do? What do we need to know to craft effective responses to growing income inequality? I like Janet Yellen's answer. More research is needed. It's true that we don't know everything about what generates inequality, but I would argue we know enough to build a body of evidence on potential gap closers. And we're convinced at the foundation, our stance is that high quality social science research on youth development can help. And not just in education, by the way, in workforce transition, in the field of immigration, in child welfare and mental health, in the justice system. All of these are key domains for the William T. Grant Foundation. All of these are domains that we've called out where we think new bodies of evidence are needed on ways to reduce inequality. So for example, post-secondary education and workforce transition, we commissioned a paper from Gene Rosenbaum, an expert in this domain. We reminded him that in 1988, now 26 years ago, the William T. Grant Foundation issued a report called The Forgotten Half, which was about our national underinvestment in young people who don't go to college. And we asked Rosenbaum to tell us, who are the forgotten half today? And what he discovered was the forgotten half today are people who go to college but get nothing out of it. No degree, no certification, no qualification, no transfer, nothing, except maybe debt. There are those who attend but do not complete college. A very high proportion of young people who complete high school go on to some form of post-secondary education. 87%, according to Rosenbaum. Something like 2/3, even from the lowest third of the socioeconomic distribution, go on for some form of post-secondary education. And yet, half of them reap no rewards. So we need more research that describes the new college reality, that studies improvement in high school and college counseling, which can be crucial to reducing these disparities, and shows us how to improve high school, college, and workplace links towards reducing inequality in post-secondary education and workforce development. Financial support is part of the story. Sometimes people say, well, almost everybody graduates high school is going to college, so why do we need financial aid? Well, when you ask people, why did you not complete your college education, the number one answer they give is financial struggles. So financial support is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. A second domain, immigrant children and families. Here we ask Carola Suarez Orozco, Hirokazu Yoshikawa, and Vivian Tseng to write about the approaches to reducing inequality for immigrant children and families. And they argue that the context of immigration intersect to generate inequality. It's not just about immigrant status per se, it's about the intersection of immigration with poverty, newcomer status, language barriers, undocumented status. Whereas family and education provides context, potential context for alleviating inequality. They developed a research agenda that places immigrants as a core policy concern, not just as a variable in a regression equation, but as central to the research agenda, and focuses on the study of policy efforts to aid immigrant adaptation, such as deferred action for childhood arrivals, and who knows, maybe if the Supreme Court calls it, perhaps the parallel program for parents. We need studies of these programs to see if they are boosting immigrant adaptation and reducing inequality for immigrants. In the education domain, we need research on ways to help English language learners succeed in our schools, to achieve English language proficiency faster, to escape the trap of curricular tracks for English language learners, to go on to academically rigorous courses in high school. We need to avoid a deficit framework, thinking about what immigrants lack, and instead think about what immigrants bring to the table that can be built upon to help their success in school. A third topic we called out, mental health and mental health services. So here, Margarita Alegria and her colleagues from the Harvard Medical School wrote about disparities in child and adolescent mental health and mental health services in the United States. They report that mental health disparities both contribute to and respond to educational inequality. Childhood adversities contribute to disparities in mental health, and so we can think about a new research agenda that addresses these challenges. An agenda that studies key periods of risk, that focuses on ways to reduce adversities in childhood so as to improve longer-term trajectories, and that targets mechanisms in the family, in the school, and in the neighborhood. The fourth domain we've called out is juvenile and criminal justice. We refer to it as the justice system because our age range of 5 to 25 crosses juvenile justice and criminal justice. Now, inequality in the justice system is on all of our minds these days. It's closely bound up with educational inequality. We asked John Laub, a former director of the National Institute of Justice and now an emeritus professor at the University of Maryland, to give us some answers for this domain. How can new research help us reduce inequality in the justice system? How can we break the school-to-prison pipeline? He calls for a focus on the relationship between education system and the justice system. A focus on the implementation and outcomes of new policing practices. Approaches that change patterns of thinking. And he also points out that inequality in the justice system is closely bound up with economic inequality in the wider society. We probably can't address one without addressing the other. Now, in much of today's rhetoric, inequality seems inequal. Piketty's point was that the returns to capital exceed growth in income. In other words, if you own stuff and it's making money for you, that money grows faster than if you simply work for a living. If that's the case, it's easy to see growth in inequality as inexorable. But our stance is that inequality responds to social institutions. And if that's the case, institutions are amenable to policy. and we can do something about reducing inequality. Now, I took this photograph. I was not there in 1965 when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, but I did visit the Johnson Library in Austin, Texas, where they have a life-size copy of this photo, and I took a photo of this photo. And it reminds us that the war on poverty was brought us a set of tools that has been effective in combating inequality. Of course, the war on poverty has not been won. Poverty is still with us. But our colleagues at the Russell Sage Foundation has documented that poverty would be a lot worse without the elements of the war on poverty. Programs like food stamps, school lunches, the earned income tax credit, housing and unemployment assistance, all of these have contributed to reducing inequality below what it would be in their absence. And other programs, policies, and practices have reduced the effects of inequality on children. High-quality early childhood programs, programs that promote healthy parenting, family school engagement programs, small classes in the early elementary grades, social psychological interventions that promote a growth mindset or mitigate the effects of stereotype threat, financial aid assistance. Each of these has research backing to demonstrate that they can be effective tools in reducing inequality. The constraints of disadvantage are not unbreakable. Now, if all these programs work, why has inequality grown? Well, in part, this is because effective responses have emerged, but they are modest compared to the scope of the problem. Successful programs take time to have their effects. In education, for example, we've seen that comprehensive school reform takes 3 to 5 years before it succeeds, and yet most studies end after 1 or 2 years. We don't even sustain them long enough to see whether they're going to work or not. Another example comes from early childhood, where the effects of early childhood education are often not manifested until a decade or more later. So it takes patience to see these effects in action. Moreover, all of these approaches that I've been describing tackle the problem in one sphere at a time. A need for multiple efforts across multiple domains, across family, health, neighborhood, school, and the workforce. So all of these need to be attacked simultaneously. Finally, there's the added complexity that programs, policies, and practices work differently in different contexts and for different individuals. And so we'll need more nuanced research to try to understand how to apply the research findings to new programs, policies, and practices. When I bought a house, I was told that there are 3 things that are essential in buying a house: location, location, and location. And in my career as a researcher, I've learned that there are 3 essential elements in an effective program: implementation, implementation, and implementation. So yet another reason why we still have growing inequality, despite having identified some effective responses, is that we need to know more about implementation, about how to implement programs effectively. Now, the hallmarks of the approach at the William T. Grant Foundation, well, first of all, we support research. There are probably 1,000 foundations that are focused on inequality right now. It's the hot topic of the day. By supporting research, that probably cuts out 975 of the 1,000 foundations. In addition to that, there are some key elements in our approach. First is the focus on young people. Second is that in the long run, the research we support should lead to some action. We understand that no single study is likely to be transformative, but we hope that research will accumulate over time so that we can build, understand, test, and improve programs, policies, and practices that reduce inequality. A third key element is that we support tools that benefit many researchers. And a fourth is that we have a strongly interdisciplinary portfolio. Many of the studies that we support are themselves interdisciplinary. And certainly, if you look across our portfolio, you'll see work coming from sociology, psychology, economics, political science, social welfare, public health. All sorts of domains are represented. So we seek researchers to answer this call. Now, before I open it up for your questions, I want to talk about some specific funding opportunities at the foundation. First, as I've said at the beginning, we choose our research interests based on what's going on in the world today. We begin with a set of questions, not preconceptions. Many foundations have the answer. And when they work with researchers, it's researchers who can help them test the answer, confirm the answer, see if the answer is on the right track. That's not our approach. We think we have a question or the problem, and we think the research community is where the answers are. And so we're calling on the research community to propose potential answers to this challenge that we've raised, we and everybody else has raised, and that's the work that we want to support. We favor an interdisciplinary approach to work, as I've mentioned. We have 4 types of grant programs. We have our major research grants, our William T. Grant Distinguished Fellows Program, our William T. Grant Scholars, and our Youth Services Improvement Programs. And I'm not going to spend any time on the last. That is a program for service delivery providers within the New York City metropolitan area, within the 5 boroughs of New York. And that's the smallest part of our portfolio. But I will talk about the other 3 programs. So the research grants, these are grants to support major research projects, typically range between $100,000 to $600,000 in funding, and they typically span 1 to 3 years. There's a 2-phase process to winning these grants. It begins with a letter of inquiry. There are 3 deadlines per year in January, May, and August. Within 4 to 6 weeks, you'll get a response as to whether a full proposal is being invited. The letters of inquiries are reviewed internally to see how they fit the current interests and the criteria that we use to determine whether proposals will be funded. About 15% of the letters of inquiry generate an invitation to submit a full proposal. Now, the full proposal then goes out for external review, as well as an internal review. And a subset of the full proposals then lead to an invitation to the applicants to respond to critiques raised by the external and internal reviewers. Finally, the investigator's response comes back, and ultimately staff then makes recommendations to our Board of Trustees. So overall, about 1/3 of the full proposals ultimately get recommended to funding to our Board of Trustees. Our board meets in March, June, and October. Our board makes decisions on grants in March, June, and October. The William T. Grant Scholars Program, by contrast, is not an award for a specific piece of research. Rather, it's a career development program for early career scholars. To be eligible, one needs to be within 7 years of the terminal degree. In most cases, that's the PhD. In addition, one needs to be in a career ladder position, typically an assistant professor, although someone who is a research scientist at a university or at a nonprofit research firm is also eligible, but this is not for postdoctoral fellows. You should be in your career ladder position before applying. Individuals are nominated by their institution. You can't just apply, you have to be nominated. And institutions can only major divisions of institutions can only nominate 1 candidate per year. So the School of Education could nominate a candidate, College of Arts and Sciences could nominate a candidate, the School of Communication, School of Public Health could each nominate a candidate, but only one per year. The awards come with $350,000 for 5 years, and to be successful, you need a research plan that breaks new ground. We call it a stretch area. You need to demonstrate how this career development award will enhance your career development. What new direction will you go in? Often this is a new methodological direction, other times it's new substantive work. And the applicant also needs to identify a mentor who will assist the applicant in moving in this new direction. The application guidelines come out in the winter. The deadline is in July, but don't think you can wait until June to start your application. It's a very laborious application, and in addition, many institutions first to see who the nominee is going to be. Right now, Mike McKenzie in School of Social Work is a William T. Grant Scholar, so you've got at least one at the present time, and we'd love to see some more applications from Rutgers. The Distinguished Fellows Program brings researchers to work in policy and practice settings, and policymakers and practitioners to work in research settings. So it's a cross-role kind of development opportunity. Proposals need to, oh, I should have said this about the Scholars Program also, that proposals need to be tied to our current interests, either in the use of research evidence or in reducing inequality. And in contrast to the early career focus of the William Grant Scholars, the Distinguished Fellows are for mid-career professionals, between 8 and 20 years in their role, and we're seeking influential researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. The award provides up to $175,000 over a 6-month to a 2-year period. And so if you're a researcher, you would work in a policy or practice setting like a nonprofit agency or a state agency. For policymakers and practitioners, they might work in a university or a nonprofit research firm. The idea is to build these cross-role bridges to enhance the connections between research on the one hand and policy and practice on the other. I mentioned that we have deadlines in January and May. In some years there have been 3 deadlines a year. This year only 2, because we're in a process of rethinking the Distinguished Fellows Program. So unless you're putting in an application in May, it may look somewhat different next year. So watch this space, follow us on Twitter, or keep track of our website to see new developments in the Distinguished Fellows Program. So with that, I've described some of the nuts and bolts, and I'd be very happy to take your questions. Questions about applying, questions about my claims on educational inequality, any of it is very good. Yes.
So I just have a question about targeting the income inequality gap, because part of what I see is that might be sort of a natural state that certainly things like unionization, and as you had more power to labor, let's say from the 50s to the 70s, you just naturally had more agency with labor, and that helped suppress it. So, it might just be the case that you just have this naturally higher amount of income that's going to go to capital, and then there are just certain sort of cycle dynamics that happen. Like, for example, if you have less labor available, like right now we have a very low birth rate. So it could be 10, 20 years down the line, you do have more income that are naturally going to go to labor than capital.
Well, I got a couple of thoughts about that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me. The first thought is to throw it back at you. Is diminished power of labor a natural phenomenon?
Is diminished power? Well, there's always just a struggle between labor and capital, right? I mean, in a capitalist society, you have owners of capital, and they need labor in order to produce things. Now, as technology advances, it is probably the case that labor has a lower amount of power.
Yeah, so let me jump in. So I think there's an argument to be made for how technological advancements, globalization, and inequality itself leads to a diminished power of labor. But I would say 2 things in response. One is that while that has certainly been a rapidly accelerating process in the United States, I don't think it's inevitable. It's subject to policy. We could create policies that would restore some power to labor. In the state of Wisconsin, where I lived for 29 years, we just cut the head off of public sector unions, and that's not an inevitable process, and that's not an irreversible process. So potentially, so that's one thing. The second answer is that whereas to some degree the changes you're describing are irreversible, that doesn't mean that the impact of increasing inequality also needs to increase. And there are steps we can take to mitigate the effects of income inequality on outcomes for children. So the easiest one to argue, because almost everyone agrees with it, is the earned income tax credit. So earned income tax credit reduces income inequality in a very direct way. The limited work we have so far on outcomes for children suggests that this pays off for children. So that's just one example of how, even if you accepted your argument, which I don't totally buy, but even if you accepted it, it's still possible to temper the effects of increasing inequality on youth outcomes. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the projects you're supporting in terms of the kinds of outcomes that you're looking at?
Yes, so as I mentioned, we're interested in a wide range of outcomes, particularly in the academic, social, behavioral, and economic realms. We are supporting work that looks at child mental health outcomes, civic behavior outcomes, educational attainment in terms of like college enrollment and completion outcomes, and test score outcomes. So those are among the ones we've looked at so far. Trying to think off the top of my head, I don't think we've looked at anything that looks at the long-term economic or even short-term economic payoffs, but we're interested in that as well. As far as the domains in which we're supporting research, so education, after-school programs, child foster care agencies, university, K-12 schooling, obviously. So a fairly variety of, we would love to do more in the justice system, and in fact, we are actively seeking work on justice system, on reducing justice system inequality. I expect that if I were to give this talk a year from now, I'd be able to rattle off a couple of studies on in the justice system domain. For example, in changing police practices, in changing prison and parole policies. In fact, actually, come to think of it, we just provided a small grant to Berkeley researcher David Harding on variation across counties in the way parole policies are carried out by parole officers to see whether that has implications for recidivism. So that's another. Does that answer your question? Great. Yes.
Hi. So how do educational outcomes compare?
Do I have to stand in one place so the camera doesn't lose?
No,
So how do educational outcomes compare between black and white by socioeconomic status? So black
Yes.
in a high.
Excellent question. So differences in socioeconomic status explain somewhere between a third and a half of the racial achievement gap. So most studies show that about 2/3 of racial achievement gaps and attainment gaps lie within socioeconomic bands. But those bands are kind of crude, and there's variation within them. And income is not, or family background is not well measured, and wealth is almost never measured. So if we took all those other things into account, we might explain half of the racial gap, or even 60% of the racial gap. Even so clear that socioeconomic background, race, income, parents' occupation, parents' education, do not come close to explaining all of the racial gaps, whether it's in educational outcomes, whether it's achievement or attainment. So there's work to be done to reduce racial gaps that not simply due to economic difference in economic. Yeah. So that paper that I wrote in 2001, the one with the flawed predictions, the good part of the paper goes into this issue actually in some detail. So, and I don't think that part was wrong, even though I think the end was wrong. Bill?
Yeah, the other side of your research agenda has to do with research evidence use.
Yes.
For all researchers here.
Yes.
And I know you're moving more in the direction of identifying strategies for research evidence use. Can you give us an idea of what you're thinking about as strategies of interest?
Yes. Thanks a lot for asking that. It gives me a chance to talk about something I'm really excited about. So the having shown the conditions, or now that our grantees have shown some of the conditions where research evidence is more likely to be used, our Board of Trustees has challenged us to support work that's bolder and has bigger potential payoff. to look at how to create those conditions where research evidence is used. So we know that we know from our grantees that relationships between producers, consumers, and intermediaries is an important part of the question. But what structures support those relationships, and what incentives help to create those relationships? Well, a leading strategy among folks in the education domain has been the research practice partnership. These are entities typically based at universities, typically allied with school districts, like the Research Alliance for New York City Schools or the Consortium for Chicago School Research, which just celebrated its 25th year. And these kinds of consortia are springing up all over the country, and they provide the structure for those relationships between producers and consumers of research. They help to foster relations of trust because they develop over time. They potentially at least have sustainability beyond the presence of single individuals. So one person lead, John Easton becomes IES director. Elaine Allensworth is the new director of the consortium, and they continue their partnership. So they have the feasibility of surviving career changes among the actors involved in it. So that's one example of a strategy. Now, that's in the education domain, but as some of us have been discussing recently, we're looking at opportunities within the child welfare domain for research practice partnerships. In fact, we've got a paper on our website by Larry Palinkas that looks at research practice partnerships in the child welfare domain. So this isn't restricted to one domain. One can imagine other strategies besides the partnerships. What incentive systems would it take within universities to foster more practice-oriented work among researchers? Work that would still gain the scientific credibility and merit to the researchers who undertake them, but at the same time would be accessible, relevant, and timely, and therefore useful, and have an avenue to become useful to some kind of decision-making body, whether it's a school district, a state, a federal agency, a nonprofit, or whatever. So these are some of the issues that we hope researchers will undertake. And I want to also add, I think I said this at the beginning, we're interested also in testing the assumption that the use of research evidence actually pays off for children in the long run. So we funders, you researchers, all of us probably assume that we're not just doing this for fun. It's not just a story we tell about ourselves. We're actually doing this because we want to make a difference. Well, let's see if that happens. Let's see if we come up with research findings and decisions, take those findings into account. Does that work out better for the targets of those decisions? Let's put that to the test.
Okay. Thank you so much, Adam. This was wonderful.